I'd like to begin with just looking at one verse in Revelation, which I imagine many of you have memorized. In Revelation chapter 12, it's verse 11, and it says, "And they overcame him." Okay, so in the previous verse, they are the brethren, and him is the accuser of the brethren in the previous verse. So the accuser of the brethren is identified in verse 9 as Satan, that ancient serpent called the devil. So he is the devil, and they are the saints, or the brethren, because it says this at the end of verse 10, the power of Christ have come, the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before God day and night, has been cast down. And verse 11 says, "They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death." Now, I've taught many times on spiritual warfare. That's a favorite verse, talking about the word of their testimony, blood of the Lamb, all that. Important stuff, but not what we're talking about today. It's the last line we don't hear as much about. The church overcomes Satan by, among other things, not loving their lives unto death, which is a very unnatural thing. It's a supernatural thing. Satan believed that a person values nothing more than his life. We know he said that to God. He was trying to teach God about people. And he said, okay, I've taken all Job's things away from him, but skin for skin, all the man has, he'll give up for his life. That's Satan's opinion because it is true of Satan's people. It is, unfortunately, maybe a little true of God's people when it shouldn't be, but basically when Jesus said that we are to come to him as disciples, he said in Matthew 16 and verse 24, he said, "If anyone come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Now, denying yourself is meaning self is not going to be first anymore. All your life, self was a major consideration, perhaps the only consideration for some, as to how am I going to make decisions? What am I going to do? How will I interact with this person? Well, how am I served? By the various options. I'll pick the one that serves me best. That's human nature. And people will give up a great deal to save their own lives. In fact, it says in Hebrews chapter 2 in verse 14 and 15 that Christ took part of the same as his brethren, which is he took part of flesh and blood, so that by death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil, that he might deliver those who all their lifetimes were kept in bondage through fear of death. The fear of death keeps people in bondage. You can get people to do just about anything. Give up your car, let them in your house, rape your children, if he's got a gun to your head. Well, why? Why would you let him do that? Because you're afraid to die. Only a person who is not afraid to die can resist that. Whoever has power over your life, if you are afraid to die, can control you. That you're in bondage to them. Now, fortunately, most of the people we know don't threaten our lives, and therefore they don't manipulate us quite so much, so powerfully. But as soon as someone decides to take that approach and say, do this or I'll kill you, they can pretty much expect, in most cases, about 100% compliance. Because people are in bondage to the fear of death. And as Satan said to God, all that a man has, he'll give up for his life. But that shouldn't be the case with Christians. These ones that overcome Satan are the ones who do not love their lives, even to the death. In other words, Satan can't control them because he controls people by the fear of death. And if you say, well, sorry, I don't have that anymore. Well, then I don't have to do what Satan says or what any of his people tell me to do. I can die. This is what the Anabaptists and the early Christians said when they were actually opposed to going to war. And they were opposed to a lot of things I'm not necessarily totally opposed to, but they had a good point. They said, anyone I might kill, I don't know if they're ready to die, but I know I am. So I don't have to protect myself. They need to protect themselves. Not for me, though, because I can die. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not sure they're ready to die, but I am. And that's how every Christian should think. In fact, when I was 10 years old, Billy Graham had a crusade in Los Angeles when I was 10, 1963. And I was already a Christian. I received Christ when I was a child before that, raised in a Christian home. But I remember I'd never heard it put this way because children don't usually think about dying. You're too young to even give it any thought. It never crosses your mind. And some adults are foolish enough to never let it cross their mind too. But I know I had not really ever thought about it when I was 10 years old. And I heard Billy Graham say, I don't have to be afraid to die because I know the Lord. And, it's not like that was a revelation to me, but it's like I realized that's true. I'd never thought of it that way before. And it was very meaningful to me to realize I'm ready to die. I don't ever have to be afraid to die. And I realized what a tremendous advantage that gives me over anyone who is afraid to die. Because if I'm not afraid to die, no one can control me. And you're free. Now, these people that Satan came against in Revelation, they actually defeated him. They overcame him. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. But it was in the context of not loving their lives even to death. There's a great deal of martyrdom that has always characterized the Christian faith. Back in, I think it was 1986, a movie came out, a secular movie with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro called The Mission. How many of you have seen that movie? I saw it in the theaters when it came out. And then I rented it hundreds of times to show everyone. I remember it's a true story, based on a true story, about some Jesuits who went into, I believe it was Colombia, and evangelized natives and built a mission in the jungle and so forth. But the territory they were in was being traded from Spain to Portugal, I believe, over in Europe, and this part of Colombia, I think, was now being transferred to Portugal. Now, Spain did not allow slavery on their territories, but Portugal did. And so with this territory switching over to Portugal, the natives were in danger of slave traders coming and taking them. Now, that's the context of the movie. But the main thing about it is there are two Christians, and who'd have thought that Robert De Niro, of all people, would play a Christian. And by the way, that's the first movie I ever saw him in. Today, I don't think I want to see any Robert De Niro movies. But the first time I ever saw him was in that movie, and I thought, this guy deserves an Oscar. And he did. You should see that movie if you have not. His repentance, Saint, is just, you cannot watch that without being totally moved. That man used to be a good actor. But anyway, it was about these two Jesuit guys, and when the Portuguese were going to come and destroy the mission and take the natives into slavery, the two guys had two choices. They could either mobilize the natives into a fighting force to fight the Portuguese, or they could be pacifists and just trust God and pray and just stand there unarmed and trust their lives to God. Well, it didn't work out well for either of them. Well, it did, actually. They went to heaven. But the thing is that there was a great slaughter, men, women, and children wiped out, and it's just one of those movies when you finish it, feel like your guts have been scraped out of you. Because you just go, whoa, and I remember walking away from that movie. I had little children in those days. I remember thinking, the thing that was just on my mind is, I need to teach my children to be ready for martyrdom. Because that's what some of these kids had to face. Your children have got to be ready for martyrdom. But I realized that most of the adults I know weren't ready for martyrdom. Now, I fortunately was, even though I was raised pre-trib, and I believed that we'd be raptured before the tribulation comes. And I actually knew some people who got converted under that teaching, who I actually overheard them say, if there's no pre-trib, I don't want to even be a Christian, I think, well, you're a Christian for the wrong reason, I think. I'm not sure you are a Christian. Even though I was pre-trib for many years, I read Richard Wurmbrand, I read Corrie ten Boom, I read Fox's Book of Martyrs, I read stories, ancient and modern, of people who'd suffered in prison, some had died for their faith. And that was just part of my mental furniture, even before, frankly, before I was a teacher. So I just thought that's what a way to go. Everyone's going to die. This is something that people don't always think about, but we should all the time. I mean, we shouldn't be morbid about it, but it's not a morbid thought. I'm going to go see Jesus. Paul said, I have a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. But that's not morbid. But the thing was, I remember thinking, if I get to die, I want to die for Jesus if possible. Now, you don't always get that chance. You might die in an automobile accident. You might get a fatal disease and get killed. A war might happen and your town get blown up and you may die. We can die lots of ways. And not everyone has the privilege of dying for Jesus. But I remember always having the attitude, if I have to die, I want to die for Jesus. You only get to do it one time. And what a shame to waste a good opportunity. Well, I realized it was not up to me to decide. But I remember even while I was still pre-trib, I still thought, well, maybe I can go over to the Soviet Union, which still existed at the time, and maybe I can go preach, in the underground church. Maybe I'll get caught. And it always struck me as a very a glorious thing. And when I say glorious, I don't mean glory to me if it happened to me, but to glorify God in death, as in life, as Paul said he wished to do. Therefore, the idea of martyrdom has always been in the back of my mind, ever since I've been very young, and still is. When I was raising my kids, I was not as eager to die as at other times in my life, because I wanted to finish raising the kids. I wasn't sure who would do it if I wasn't here to do it. And most of my life has been very happy. People, I think I had a death wish. I'm not sure. It depends on what you would call a death wish. I'm not depressed. I'm not unhappy. I don't have an unhappy life. I've had trials, but they've been few and short-lived compared to the joys that I have. But all the joys we have are temporary anyway. When you come to Christ, the first thing you do is you deny yourself. And that doesn't mean you start sleeping on a bed of nails and you start fasting 4 times a week and so forth. It means you recalibrate your life so that self is no longer in the position it once held. Once you do not care whether you live or die, which is a very good way to live, I think, you may live a very long time. Jesus said if you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. If you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it unto life everlasting. Now, when he said if you seek to save your life, you'll lose it, he didn't mean if you live a healthy life so that you live longer and healthier. He means if you seek to save your life by compromise. That's in the context of him going to the cross. And if the disciples would avoid going to a cross, they'll lose their lives anyway. But if they will lose their lives for Christ's sake, then they'll find it to eternal life. There's lots of things in the Bible about this. But one verse I want to show you is in Mark chapter 10. And this statement of Jesus is actually found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but this Mark has a word in it that isn't in the others, in the parallel accounts, for whatever reasons, I don't know. But that's why I'm choosing Mark instead of Matthew or some other parallel to this. In Mark chapter 10, verse 29 and 30, Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my sake and the gospel's, who shall not receive 100-fold now in this life, in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life." Now, Jesus said, I'm asking you to forsake all that you have. In another place in Luke 14, Jesus said, if you don't take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. If you come to me and you don't hate your wife and children and your own life, also you cannot be my disciple. In the same place, he said, so if you do not forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. Now, this doesn't mean that you liquidate everything. It's obvious that I have a house. I have things. But I've never felt like I do have them, because I believe I've been bought with a price. I don't own myself. I don't own anything. Everything, if I'm a Christian, everything belongs to the King. Everything belongs to the Master. I'm a slave. And that, therefore, if I lose it, if the house would burn down, if someone break in and take all this stuff, I figure, well, sorry, God, you lost some stuff, I didn't, because it wasn't mine anyway. In fact, I remember once, when my marriage just fell apart, after many years, I remember saying to God, if she was going to run off like that, why didn't she do it earlier before she wasted 20 years of my life? And I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, 20 years of whose life? I was just rebuked right there. I mean, I felt like, okay, this isn't my life. No minute of this life is mine. It's God's. If God wanted me to spend 20 years of it taking care of this person and this family and so forth, that's, if God feels that's how he wants that wasted, it's probably not really wasted at all. But the point is, you can't really see anything as your own. That's what it says about the early Christians in Acts chapter 4. It says, no one said that anything that he possessed was his own. Why not? Because it all belonged to Christ. That's part of becoming a Christian. You lay it all down. Now, a lot of people think of coming to Christ as simply adding something to their life. I remember I was witnessing with a guy back in the 70s on the street, an older guy who did more of that, had done it longer than I had. I was kind of not really mentoring under him, but kind of watching to see how it was done. And I remember we were talking to some hippie or something, and the guy said, well, I don't want to be a Christian because I'd have to give up sleeping with my girlfriend. And this guy said, oh, Jesus didn't come to take things away from you. He just came to give you stuff. He's not going to take that from you. I thought, wait a minute, this is not the way I want to do evangelism. That's not the way God does it. But that was a sort of a mentality. You come to Jesus, you just get all this and more. You get all you had before and you never lose anything. Except Jesus said you have to forsake all that you have to be my disciple. And you do receive more, as that verse just said. If you give up houses, lands, family, anything for his sake, you'll receive 100-fold more in this life with persecutions and in the next eternal life. So actually, he kind of lists the persecutions along with the good stuff, as if maybe that's one of the good things. Persecution is a pretty normal thing in church history. It's just not very normal in American church history. That is, we live at a time that's very unlike all other times in history. We take it for granted, perhaps. People who were born after World War II, and not very much after World War II, live in the most privileged, that is, if they're in America, they live in the most privileged, wealthiest, peaceful season of human history, and especially the best for Christians' comfort. For everyone's comfort, but Christians have comfort here too. We haven't had wars on our shores in the past 60, more like 80 years. And, we haven't, we've had the wealthiest, we've lived in the most wealthy country in the world with the best medical technology and the best, things that people never had before. We have indoor plumbing. Yeah, well, whoever didn't take that for granted. Well, if anyone before, let's say, the year 1800 had indoor plumbing, they thought they'd died and gone to heaven. They thought they were a Raja or a monarch of some kind. Well, indoor plumbing, who ever heard of that? You can turn on lights, you can turn on the climate control in your house. We have every comfort and many, many comforts that no one had before. I often still think of this when I drive my car somewhere on a cold day, that we don't have to get out in the horse and buggy and ride out in the elements. We can close the doors, set the temperature, have the temperature exactly the way we want it, listen to the music we want to listen to or the talk. It's like we live in total luxury and comfort. And yet, most people and most Christians have never known those things, and they would never have taken them for granted if they got them late in life. We got them early in life, so we have that tendency. We think, well, we should be comfortable. Why? Because all my neighbors are. In fact, there's even the prosperity doctrine people out there that say, well, we're king's kids. We should have more comforts than anyone. We should be richer than everyone, which is, of course, a false doctrine. But the point is, that's a doctrine that could only arise and thrive in a society like ours where wealth and health and comfort are regarded as the norm. And they are indeed the norm in our society. What we see happening right now, though, if you've been paying attention, is there's a shift in our society. And it may shift back. You never know. There's always, peaks and troughs in the benefits of civilization as history goes by. But many of us feel that a time of persecution is very possibly coming to us, and it's about time, frankly. Origen said, a church that has no persecution is a church that is dying. No, he said, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. He said a church that has no martyrs is a church that is dying. Interesting. Well, why would that be? Because if a church is alive, it's a threat to Satan. And a church that's alive is a threat to Satan, And therefore, Satan does what he can to be a threat to the church. And that often includes some martyrdom. But they overcome him. They defeat him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. In the book of Acts, persecution begins really early on. In Acts chapter 3, Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 5, the apostles are arrested. They're beaten and released. Later on, of course, Stephen is the first martyr. He actually gets stoned to death. Which we read it in the story, and it's like ancient history. We think, oh yeah, well, that is a pretty bad thing for people to do to him. But, I mean, think about it. If there was someone in your fellowship, maybe this is your fellowship, or maybe you have another fellowship you go to, but somebody in your fellowship that, just got pulled out of his house and shot in the street for no other reason than he was preaching the gospel. Now, that actually happens in Muslim countries. That actually happens in Hindu countries. And that happens in, communist countries, used to. But it doesn't happen in this country. Not quite like that. Not yet. But that's what happened to the early church. That's how their church started out with this kind of thing. In fact, it started with Jesus being murdered, tortured, and murdered for having done nothing else but having taken a stand for what's true. And that's what Christians have faced throughout the book of Acts. It certainly is one of the main themes as you read the first 30 years of the apostolic age in Acts. It's, Stephen gets put to death. James is beheaded. Peter's arrested and is on schedule to be executed the next day. And an angel lets him out of prison, so he escapes for the time being, but later dies in Rome. I mean, think about that. James and Peter, these are two of the three guys, Peter, James, and John, that were the leading, most prominent apostles in the church. James goes first. He's the first apostle to die. And Herod, the king, just says, I think I'll kill this guy. And pulls James out, beheads him. And he says, that pleases the Jews. I think he'll do the same to Peter. Arrest Peter and puts him in jail. Says, we'll kill him tomorrow. Imagine if in your church, any church you've ever been in, if the authorities just kind of came into the church, pulled your pastor out, the assistant pastor out or whatever, and just said, okay, we're going to behead this guy right here. Now again, in some Muslim and Hindu countries, that happens. It doesn't seem so strange, but how strange it would be to us. And we are living in a bubble of unreality. I mean, this is our reality at the moment. But we make a mistake if we think that our reality at this time is anything like reality in general, the world over or throughout history. And this is something where I believe the American church is going to have some problems. They could include martyrdom. And if not martyrdom, at least prison. And some people who go to prison die there too. But the point is, we could have everything taken from us if we own something. However, if we don't, if everything of ours belongs to God, then there's nothing that can be taken from us. We have already taken up a cross. Now, a man who takes up a cross is not dead yet. He's not even crucified yet. He's not even hanging on the cross yet. He's carrying a cross to the place where he expects to die. And he doesn't have any long-term plans because he knows that within minutes or at the most hours, he's going to be hanging on that cross, and within a few hours after that, he'll be dead. That's already been determined. That's why he's carrying a cross. Jesus said, you want to follow me? You carry a cross. It doesn't mean you have to die. You might not have the privilege. It doesn't mean that you have to live a bad life. That is a harmful or painful life. It does mean, though, that you are recognizing that the life you're living is going to end up in a finite period of time from now with death. Now, it might not even be martyrdom. It might be just what everyone goes through. Everyone dies. And therefore, to live under a cross is to live with the recognition that I'm on my way, not very long from now, to leaving this world. And a man who's carried a cross to the place of his execution in biblical times, he kind of had released his ownership of just about everything. All his dreams, all his ambitions, all his goals, all his agendas, those are pretty much gone. He had those before he took up the cross. But when he takes up that cross, he knows, no more of that. Nothing I planned. I'm now at the mercy of those who are leading me. Now, when we take up our cross, we're following a king who actually bore one himself. Because a good shepherd always goes ahead of the sheep. He doesn't send his sheep places that he won't go himself. And so he expects us to carry a cross. So he did. And he died. And some of his disciples have actually died more horribly than he did. I actually think that the Apostle Paul in his generation suffered more than any other Christian of his generation. If you read the list in 2 Corinthians of the ways he'd suffered, he'd received 39 lashes 5 times. He'd been beaten with rods 3 times. He'd been in prisons. He'd been shipwrecked. He'd been floating on flotsam in the sea several times before it happened in Acts. We know that at the end of Acts, Paul's shipwrecked again. But he wrote 2 Corinthians long before that happened, and he said, he's been three times shipwrecked, floating around in the Mediterranean Sea on a piece of wood. It's a dangerous life being a Christian in some places. Of course, we might say not anymore. That's when things were getting started. Well, that's one reason I want to talk about this is to let you know that ours is the weird time. Ours where we don't have to worry about anyone killing us because we're Christians. That's in this particular space. We are in the bubble. We're in the unreality bubble that most Christians the world over live outside of, and that throughout history they did. And we need to have simply the martyr's mind. It's actually a warrior's mindset. Paul said to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2:2, he said, endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Paul and Peter both died as martyrs under Nero. You may know their stories. Paul was arrested and sent to Rome before the end of the book of Acts. And when the book of Acts ended, Paul was in prison in Rome waiting to stand trial for his life before Nero. The book of Acts ends and we don't get any more history given to us. However, there are evidences in his later epistles, the last ones he wrote, which are the pastoral epistles, that he was released from that imprisonment. He traveled to some more places, and then he got arrested again. And around probably 66, 67 AD, when Nero was persecuting Christians, Paul was beheaded. And Peter, likewise, probably a little later, but it's still under the same persecution of Nero, I think it's Hegesippus, the church historian, who tells this story that Peter was fleeing from Rome because of the persecution of Nero. And he was on his way out on the road and he saw Jesus coming back into Rome. Now, Jesus, of course, had gone to heaven decades earlier, so it must have been a vision. But Peter said, where are you going, Lord? And Jesus said, I'm going back to Rome to be crucified again. And so Peter decided to turn around and go back to Rome, and he was arrested. And as many of you probably heard, when he was sentenced to be crucified, he said, I'm not worthy to die the way Jesus did. Crucify me upside down, which I think would be probably more painful, although neither way is very comfortable, to say the least. And so these, the two, probably the greatest apostles in the first century, they died in that way, as did all the other apostles, with the possible exception of John. Traditionally, John was dipped in boiling oil and was not harmed by it, and so he was banished to the island of Patmos and died a natural death later in Ephesus. That's the tradition. But all the other apostles traditionally died in various ways as martyrs. But it wasn't just for the apostles. Nero killed at least hundreds, if not thousands, of Christians. The Roman historians record that Nero set the city of Rome on fire, apparently with the intention of getting credit for rebuilding it. And then when he found out that he was unpopular because people suspected he set the city on fire, he blamed the Christians and began to arrest them and feed them to lions. He'd sew them up into the skins of animals and toss them to dogs to be torn apart. He would cover them with pitch and put them up on posts and burn them as torches in his garden, while he'd have his friends, ride the chariots through the garden, watch the Christians burn. This is the demonic, satanic madman that the early Christians were martyred by. But he wasn't the last. Domitian did the same kind of thing, and later on, under Trajan, we have quite a few martyr stories. One of the famous martyrs under Trajan was Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch, and he was arrested and taken to Rome to be fed to the lions. And as he was carried to Rome, he wrote 7 letters, which still exist. And in them, he says pretty much the same thing mostly. he wrote to the Roman Christians and said, I know you'll be tempted to try to appeal to Trajan to release me. Don't. I've looked for it all my life to this day, to be like Jesus, to be able to give my life for the kingdom of God. And this is a passage from Ignatius' letter they wrote on the way to Rome as his prisoner. He says, I begin now to be a disciple. I care nothing of visible or invisible things, so that I may win Christ. Let fire and the cross, let companies of wild beasts, let breaking of bones and tearing of limbs, let grinding of the whole body and all the malice of the devil come upon me. Be it so, only may I win Christ Jesus. Now, these various forms of dying, having limbs torn off, being fed to the lions, being crushed and so forth, the reason he mentioned them is because that's the way Christians were being killed. This stuff was happening to them. If you read Fox's Book of Martyrs, you'll see some amazing stories. And amazing in more than one way. Amazing that human beings can be so cruel to other human beings as those who persecuted the Christians, but even another way. I was given a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs when I was 16 as a birthday gift. And I thought, oh great. You know, I didn't think I'd like reading those stories because I've got a weak stomach. I don't like watching a movie where they're doing surgery and it shows it. I don't like to see the insides of people and things like that when they're still alive. And I'm very sympathetic. I'm really even sympathetic to roadkill when I see it on the road. Yeah, I ran over a squirrel once and it ruined my whole day. I'm just a wimp that way, I guess. I'm not saying this is how people need to be. It's how I am. And therefore I didn't think I'd want to read these tortures and martyrdoms of Christians. But I finally heard so much about Fox's Book of Martyrs, I decided to read it. And I was so glad I did, because it had the exact opposite effect. It did describe tortures and martyrdoms of Christians, but what it really focused on was their courage, including women. Women with, like one woman with 7 children, they were all martyred together. And she watched her sons die, and she encouraged them to stay strong in the faith as they're under Inquisition, and she died. But she was described by Fox as a woman of tender disposition, like she's not really a tough, strong kind of woman, but she was heroic. And the reason you see this in these stories is because God does something for the Christian in that hour. Remember when Jesus said to his disciples, when they bring you before council and so forth, don't premeditate what you'll say, because the Spirit of your Father in you will give you the words. Well, not only does the Spirit of your Father in you give you the words, he gives you the grace. God gives grace, which is something that many of us know very little about because of the smallness of our trials. Christians all know grace because we all are saved by grace. And even in our small trials, God gives us grace in them. But I remember watching a movie about Michael Sattler once. Michael Sattler was one of the early Anabaptist Mennonite type martyrs. They did horrible things to him. And there was a movie made about it. And I remember watching it, and I knew the story before I saw the movie, but it was very graphically portrayed. All the things they did to him that were horrible. And I remember laying in bed that night after watching the movie. I saw it in a theater. And I was home and laying in bed thinking, God, I know that's what Christians often have to go through. And I know that I don't deserve to be treated any better than that. This man was a better man than I am. And I just thought, how though can I be faithful under that kind of torture? I can hardly be faithful thinking about that kind of torture, I just felt like the Lord assured me. He said, well, Michael Sattler and the other martyrs, they weren't any different than you. But their circumstances were different. I give you small grace for your small trials. When you have big trials, you have big grace. There's much grace. And the Anabaptist martyrs had a signal, because sometimes, because they would preach to the crowds while they were being burned at the stake, their persecutors decided to take their tongues out first, so they couldn't preach. And so they had an agreement. If I can't preach, I will signal to you if God is making this torture bearable. And the signal is they put up their fingers. I don't know if they put them together like this or if they just put them up, but that was the signal the Anabaptists had. As I'm dying, if I can't tell you that God's giving me grace, I'll declare it by putting my fingers up. And Sattler's hands were tied behind him, and he was burned at the stake after they'd done some horrible other things to him. And the ropes burned off his hands, and so he put his fingers up like this. And that was not uncommon. Even the Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century, when they were being fed to lions and so forth, they often had a signal to the other martyrs waiting in the cages waiting for them. They had a hand signal of some kind they gave, saying, God is helping. God is giving me strength here. You know, I don't know what it's like to suffer extreme pain because I've never been in that position. But I do know that I've never been in any kind of pain, emotional or physical, that God didn't make it bearable. And, you know, sometimes you say, God will never give you more than you can handle. Well, He can. He can give you more than you can handle. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he says, I don't want you to be ignorant of the troubles that came upon us in Asia, how that we were pressed beyond measure, above strength. Okay? Our trials were off the charts beyond measure. And it was above our strength to endure. But he said, but the Lord delivered me. Nothing is above our strength to endure if God is delivering, if God is giving it. I think the reason people say God will never give you something you can't handle is they're paraphrasing what Paul said, of course, in 1 Corinthians 10, I believe it is, where he said, God is faithful, will not allow you to be tempted above that which you're able to endure. But with the temptation will provide a way of escape that you might be able to bear it. Escape doesn't mean you get out of the trouble. But God does, martyrdom has been the characteristic of the church. In fact, the word martyrdom, until recent years, has almost been entirely a Christian word. The Greek word martyr, it just means witness. The word witness, or one who gives testimony, is in Greek martyr, martyr. And it was through Christian martyrdom, giving witness to the point of death, that it began to take on the connotation of somebody who dies for his witness, because Christians so regularly did it. Now, of course, people would talk about, these Muslim extremists who blow themselves up. They probably think of them as martyrs. I just consider them to be homicidal maniacs. They're not giving their lives for God. They're destroying other people's lives. There's a big difference between allowing yourself to die and destroying someone else's life who's innocent. But martyrdom is almost a uniquely Christian phenomenon, and also one of the most common phenomena in Christian history. Not only did Ignatius die under Trajan, many other Christians did. Under Marcus Aurelius from 162 to 180, there are several famous martyrs. Polycarp was one of them. Polycarp was one who actually knew John the Apostle. And Polycarp was the bishop or the overseer of the church in Smyrna, which is one of the churches that Revelation is written to, but probably Polycarp was there later instead. Polycarp Polycarp apparently was born in 70 AD, and he died in 156 AD, and at that time, when they tried to get him, he was very old, when they tried to get him to deny Christ, he said, I've served him 86 years, and he's never done me wrong. Why would I ever, renounce my king? And they put him to the fire. They were going to nail him to the stake and then burn him. That's what they typically did. But he said, no, I'll stand here. You don't have to nail me here. I'll stay here. And so he stood there by the stake as the fires were lit. And this is the only martyr story of this type that I know of from the early church. But the flames all made a big, they kind of made a concave wall around him. The flames went up, but they didn't touch him. And this so aggravated the killers of him that a soldier speared him and he bled to death. And then they were able to burn his body, but the flames wouldn't touch his body while he was alive. Now, don't count on that. A lot of Christians died, burned at the stake, and the flames had no trouble with the flavor of their bodies. But he is a pretty important case. And the martyrdom of Polycarp is actually a written document, written by the Church of Smyrna of the 2nd century. It's one of the ancient documents we still have describing this thing. I mentioned Felicitatus and her 7 sons was put to death under Marcus Aurelius. Justin Martyr, you probably have heard of. He's one of the important early church fathers. He was beheaded in 165. Perpetua was a 22-year-old Carthaginian noblewoman. She was newly married and had a baby, and she was arrested for being a Christian. And so she was put to death. Her baby was not. Her baby was given to others and raised by a Christian people. But there was also at the same time a woman named Felicitas, a slave girl, And in the year 202, these two were martyred with others. And her story, Perpetua's story, is preserved also in the Church Fathers' records. But just to show that they didn't show mercy on women either, you know. You might think that, you know, you got to go lightly on the milder sex. Well, the Romans didn't think that way, and most persecutors of Christians don't. What they hate is not men, but they hate is Christ. And a woman can be as much an offender to them as a man can in that respect. Under Catholic and Protestant regimes, many martyrs were made. The Roman Catholic Church killed lots of Christians. Some of them were Christians that were called Waldenses, followers of a man named Peter Waldo. This is before the Reformation, sadly for them. And they disagreed with Roman Catholic doctrine. They pretty much held doctrines a lot like Martin Luther would later hold, but maybe 1,000 years earlier. And they were hunted down. That's what the Inquisitions were made for. The Catholic Inquisitions, they had all these terrible torture devices. They tortured these people and killed many of them. It is estimated as many as 50 million people throughout history have been killed at the order of the papacy. Christians, Protestants usually. And the Waldensians were killed under the popes in great numbers. John Huss is famous just 100 years before Luther. John Huss, a Bohemian pastor, was preaching the same kind of things that Luther would preach 100 years later. John Huss was just as controversial among the Catholics as Luther was, but he didn't make it out alive like Luther did. Huss was ordered to come to a trial to give, or to some kind of place to give an account of his doctrines. And he said, I'm not going to come there. You'll kill me. And they said, no, we guarantee you immunity. We will not arrest you. So he went, and they arrested him and sentenced him to die. And he said, but you promised me you wouldn't do that. They said, well, promises made to a heretic don't count. So, and typical of the devil's people, no interest in truth. But Huss was burned at the stake, and Tyndale in England was also strangled and burned. He was a Bible translator. It was offensive to the popes that the Bible should be translated out of Latin, which is not its original language anyway, but it's what the Catholics use, the Latin Bible. He translated it into English. Wycliffe and Tyndale both did, and that's what got them into trouble. They both were burned at the stake, although Wycliffe was strangled first and then burned. I mentioned the Anabaptists earlier. These were the ones who, they were a branch off of the Reformation in Switzerland. Zwingli was the reformer in Switzerland, and he had some young men that he was teaching Greek to and told them, read the Bible and follow what it says. Well, they began to doubt infant baptism as they read the Bible. Zwingli still believed in it. And he couldn't persuade them to give it up, so they became what's called the Anabaptists. Anabaptist means rebaptized. Everyone in Europe was baptized at birth, because they're all Catholics. Except in Protestant countries, they were baptized Lutherans or Reformed, but they were all baptized. But the Anabaptists were the ones who said, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about babies being baptized. The Bible says believe and be baptized. Repent and be baptized. So we should believe and repent before we're baptized. And we have, since our infant baptism, we have believed and repented. And therefore, we should be baptized. You wouldn't think that'd be so controversial, but it was considered subversive. Because the state church and the state were wedded. And if you're saying the baptism that the state church gave me when I was a baby isn't valid, you're invalidating the whole state religion. And it's like treason. And so just by being baptized again, they were subjected to martyrdom. They were usually drowned. Their persecutors called it the third baptism. And Zwingli himself authorized the murder of 4,000 Anabaptists in Switzerland. The Mennonites came from that movement. The Hutterites came from that movement. Amish eventually came from that movement. But they had many, many martyrs. In fact, I mentioned Fox's Book of Martyrs. If you've seen it, it's a pretty big book of martyrs. There's a bigger book about the size of an old Strong's Concordance called Martyr's Mirror, which is the Anabaptist martyrs. And one of the great stories that they have, because they were nonviolent, they didn't believe in self-defense or anything, They just believed this in the Sermon on the Mount. And so one of them, a guy named Dirk Willems, was in Holland, was running from persecutors, and he was being followed by a bounty hunter to take him back and have him killed. And he fled, and he just barely made it across a frozen lake where the ice was thin. But he made it to the other side. And the guy who was pursuing him and fell through the ice and couldn't get out and was going to die. And you'd think Dirk Willems would say, "Thank you, Lord. I'm out of here." But Willems said he couldn't just let the man die, so he went back and rescued him. And then as the story goes, the man said, run away, because you're going to get killed if I take you back. But the people on the shore on the other side were shouting at the officer saying, "Do your job, bring him home." So he arrested him, took him back, and Dirk Willems was beheaded, I believe. Let's see, what was he? Burned. He was burned, yeah. Yeah, I can't remember how all of them died, but this is commonplace. We just trace through all of church history. It happens all through. There's a movie that was out a few years ago. It came out in, what year was it? It came out in 2016. Silence, yeah. How many saw the movie Silence? That's got Liam Neeson in it, which is interesting because the movie The Mission had Liam Neeson in it. He was a really young man. And Silence has it. And both of them are kind of similar stories. Both true stories. Andrew Garfield is one of the main actors in this one. But I think Scorsese made this movie.
You did?
Yeah.
Did you watch it?
I have seen it, yeah. And it's a very sad movie. It's a true story. Over 400 Japanese missionaries and Christians, these were Catholic Jesuit missionaries, because it was mostly before the Reformation. But they were horrendously tortured and crucified by the Japanese. And so that's been memorialized in an interesting movie too, called Silence. Just came out in 2016. But these are Christian martyrs all over the world, not just in Europe. It happened in Japan. Now, of course, in the 19th and 20th centuries, Protestants began to send missionaries out all over the world. So there's a lot of martyr stories from people going into jungles and being eaten by, cannibals and things like that. A really sad story that I heard from Weilamer, because they have a lot of activity in Fiji. They said when missionaries first came to Fiji, the king there had this really ornate comb in his hair made from a shell. And one of the women missionaries, when they first met him, she wanted to compliment him. She touched the shell and said, "Oh, this is such a beautiful thing." But she didn't know that you can't touch the king. And so she and the other missionaries were put to death. One thing that missionaries often suffered was that they'd go to countries where they didn't have immunity to the local diseases. And of course, some people say they brought our diseases to them and sometimes killed off tribes that way. They didn't know about it. They didn't know they were doing that. But the thing is that so many European missionaries and American missionaries went to certain places in Africa and just died there a few years later of these diseases they had been exposed to there, that missionaries began to, instead of packing their clothes in suitcases and trunks, they took them in coffins because they didn't want to have, the people they're going to have the expense of building a coffin for them because they knew they were going to die there. This is the mentality of Christians throughout history. How many of them do you know with that mentality? Probably not a lot. In the 19th century, I read about one young man who went and he was martyred there, and he was delighted to go there. I believe he's British, and when he was assigned there by his mission agency, he didn't know where he was going to until they assigned him to go to Korea. And he said, "Yay, I'm going to go to the land of martyrs," because that's what Korea was. The missionaries go there to die. That's true of many countries. Martyrs, they went there to die. But they wanted to get some people saved first. They just didn't plan to live long afterward. Of course, probably the most famous missionary martyrs in my lifetime were Jim Elliot and his 4 friends, Nate Saint, Roger Jordan, Ed McCully, and Pete Fleming. These were 5 very talented, intelligent, educated American guys in their 20s who went down to Ecuador. They knew of a tribe that had been visited by a Catholic missionary 50 years earlier, but they'd killed the missionary. They were a very ferocious Stone Age tribe. And these guys said, these people need to know Jesus. And all their friends said, you guys could have good ministries here in the United States. You don't need to go down and, you're going to die. You're being a fool. And Jim Elliot was famously said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose. And they went down there, and yes, they were speared to death almost as soon as they had encounters on the beach with the natives. That was a very famous one. It was also made more known because Jim Elliot's wife and also Nate Saint's wife, both of them went into the jungle after their husbands were killed and converted the tribe. And Jim Elliot's wife took their 3-year-old daughter with her too. And she goes to the same place that killed her husband, and she managed to convert them all. Now, in modern times under communism, by the way, that thing with those guys in Ecuador, that was just in 1956. That's in my lifetime. I was just a kid then. But I heard about it all my life because it's such a famous story. It is said that when the news of the death of these missionaries came back to the States, I think the U.S. Marines were thinking of going down there to wipe out that tribe. And I think Christian missionaries begged them off and said, don't do that. But the news of their martyrdom came back to the States, and I understand, I've heard this for years, over 1,000 U.S. college students volunteered for missions. And this is why they overcome Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by not loving their lives to death. Satan, you might think Satan wants to kill you, that'd be his favorite thing. Not necessarily. If there's no other way to get rid of you and he can't tolerate you anymore, he may try all he can to kill you. He can't unless God lets him. But I think the devil's afraid to kill some people. I think he'd rather try almost anything else first because it doesn't work out well for him. When a faithful Christian dies faithfully, that doesn't work out well for the kingdom of darkness. It usually inspires more missionaries, inspires more conversions. We know when the Christians died in the Roman arenas, Tertullian, living at that time, wrote a letter to the emperor and said, if you're trying to stamp out Christianity, you must not do it that way. Because every time one of us dies in the arena, scores of people in the stands get converted, watching. He said, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Our blood is splattered and the seeds of the gospel go out to more people and more people are converted. That is true. You see, we're conquering when we lay down our lives for Christ. And many, many stories are like that. But it's really, the devil took out these 5 missionaries, but it was quite a risk for him. He didn't win by it. The tribe got saved anyway. And 1,000 American missionaries went out on the field after that. And so, to lay down your life, you may actually conquer more territory than not. Instead of Samson, who was not the most faithful believer, as we know, but it says that he killed more of the enemy in his death than he did in his lifetime. And there's a sense in which we can have greater victories, perhaps, in the right kind of death than in surviving. Under communism, there were people like Richard Wurmbrand in Romania, and lots of people in the communist countries in Europe, of course, in Eastern Europe. In China, there was Watchman Nee, there's Brother Yun. These are famous Christians that started the house church movement and ran the house church movement in China during the time of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was one of the most brutal dictators and killers of Christians in all history. Watchman Nee, we knew of him when I was young. He was in prison in China for 20-something years. We get reports, I don't know how many of them were true, but he was a leader in the Chinese church, and we heard that he got dismembered piece by piece and so forth. But he actually survived till the fall of Mao's government, and he was released, and he died a free man, but after 20 or more years in prison and under torture. Brother Yun, the same way. Brother Yun is still living, and he was one of the 3 main leaders in the Chinese underground church, and he's now escaped from China, but he was imprisoned and beaten and, all kinds of things to kill him. And God worked all kinds of miracles to get him out of there. And His story is called The Heavenly Man, if you ever see that book. It's a biography of him. I like to read these kind of biographies. Richard Wurmbrand, I mentioned, was a Lutheran pastor in Romania. And when communism took over, he stood up against them, and he got arrested. He spent 14 years under torture in prison, and horrendous tortures. 3 of those years he was in solitary confinement. He finally got out because I think American Christians kind of interceded for him and paid a ransom for him to be released. They came to America, and his body was covered with scars. He couldn't stand on his feet because they'd been beaten so much. He'd take his shirt off when he spoke places. I saw him a couple of times, and he's all scarred up from just abuse. And yet he wrote a number of books. He started an organization called Voice of the Martyrs that reaches out to persecuted Christians. These guys who get persecuted and even some of the ones who die end up, being the founders of organizations that really make strides for the kingdom of God. Dying for Jesus is not something to be afraid of. You're going to die for something. You're going to die for something. And I said, yeah, but I might die young if I'm a martyr. True, you might. You might. And you might die young if you're not a martyr. Could die young of almost anything. I was married once to a woman who was 25 years old and she died. She was ready to die for Jesus. We talked about it all the time. She would have gladly been a martyr, but she didn't get to it. She was hit by a truck and killed, but at age 25. So just, avoiding martyrdom isn't going to guarantee you're going to live long. The point is your life has got to be on the altar all the time. Paul said, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And you are a living sacrifice presented to God while you're alive, but you may become a dying sacrifice too, and many Christians have. I want to just give you some very recent things, then I'll wind this up. Under Islam and Hinduism, in those countries that are dominated by those, many, many martyrs to Christ have been made in modern times. I've got several of them. You may have heard this story. I remember when it was in the news in 1999. An Australian missionary, his name is Graham Staines. He was working with leprosy victims in India and with his family. And he and his 2 sons, one of whom was 6 and one was 10, were sleeping overnight in their car one night, and radical Hindu activists came and burned the car, and burned him and his sons up in the car. The group that did that was actually called Bajrang Dal. Bajrang Dal was the radical Hindu group that did that. In Afghanistan, the Taliban killed a lady named Gail William, who was a Christian British worker in a relief organization over there. She was just walking down the street, and they pulled over and shot her dead. That was in 2008. In Kenya, in 2014, 35 Kenyan Christians were killed by village raiders of Al-Shabaab, a Muslim organization. 35 Kenyan Christians, these are villagers, just minding their own business. And these guys come in and raid the village and massacre them, men, women, and children. Similar thing in 2015 in Libya. There were 21 Egyptian Christians working there. And you may have seen images of this because it wasn't very long ago. The ISIS came and lined up the men and had them on their knees and just went through and cut their heads off. They had them in orange jumpsuits like prisoners. You remember that image? That was in 2015, 21 Egyptian Christians killed that way. 20 Christians in Nigeria were shot by Boko Haram on October 20th. In October 2016. Now, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria has killed lots of Christians. I don't have the total numbers. When we were ministering over in that part of Africa. We weren't very, very close to where they were, but we were close enough to be a little concerned because they were doing this kind of stuff at the time, but we didn't run into them. But they've killed lots of Christians there. 4 pastors working in tribal regions in India were martyred in 2017. This I got from Michael Brown, a book he wrote called No Fear of the Antichrist, or Not Afraid of the Antichrist, I think it's called. These were friends of his, that's why he told that story. He also told about a Nigerian woman friend of his in 2018 who said, quote, that the slaughter of Christians in Nigeria is happening every day. The worst was this year was the New Year's Day massacre. following a mass burial of 73 victims. Villages were razed, which means burned down. Girls and women were raped. Men were butchered. This was in 2018 in Nigeria. A magazine, Christian Today, in February 2016 said 11,500 Christians in northern Nigeria were killed by Boko Haram in the 5 years between 2006 and 2014. Anyway, so that's more than 5 years. Well, there were some of the years that it wasn't happening. In 5 of the years in that period of time, saw 11,500 Christians killed, simply murdered, and 13,000 churches were destroyed, forcing 1.3 million Christians to flee to safer areas of the country. Okay, so how about in the USA? We don't have that kind of thing going on here, right? Well, I honestly don't have any martyr stories from the USA, but there's stories that are not encouraging in the area. I mean, unless we think of persecution as a positive thing, which it might be. But you've all heard these stories because they're very recent. In 2012, the Christian baker Jack Phillips, who owned Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, he was sued by the Civil Rights Commission of Colorado for refusing to design a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. By the way, he beat that in court. But then another attack came against him, and he was fined $500 for some other lesser thing because they didn't want to let him off easy. This man you may have heard of also, Mark Hook. He's a pro-life sidewalk counselor in Philadelphia, father of 7. He was standing on a street in front of a abortion clinic in Philadelphia, and with his 12-year-old son. And some guy who was hired by the abortion industry to escort girls past these protesters into the clinic. This guy who was an escort began harassing the 12-year-old boy. And the father said, "Hey, leave him alone," you know. And the other guy pushed the father, and the father pushed him back, and that's all that happened. No harm was done, but the father his house was raided by the FBI in tactical gear. You know, a whole bunch of them broke into his house in the middle of the night and hauled him off in front of his children. He actually beat that in court too. So some of these things are encouraging in the sense that the courts are still, going the right way in many cases. But it's not very encouraging to know that the law enforcement agencies just feel like they can try this. No one would have tried this 10 years ago. They're getting very bold. They're probably just testing the water to see how much they can get away with. 6 pro-life demonstrators were sentenced to 11 years in prison for peaceful sit-in at Washington, D.C. abortion facility. This is actually just this year, on January 20th. I heard about this on the news too at the time. There was, I don't remember, I guess there were 11, I forget, I don't remember the total number, but they were, sitting down. They were not blocking access, but they were accused of blocking access. And there's a law against blocking access to abortion clinics called the FACE, F-A-C-E Act. I don't know what it stands for, but basically it has to do with access to the clinic. And they were just sitting there singing hymns. And there were children, and there was even a woman who's 87 years old among them. They were all arrested, and they were just this year sentenced to 11 years in prison. Now, 11 years in prison for sitting singing hymns and harming nobody. And yet, in the same city, if you carjack, if you kill somebody, if you loot a store, there won't even be any prosecution at all. But sit and sing hymns in front of an abortion clinic, and you get 11 years in prison. That's a long sentence. And they're there now. You heard probably about the case. This was an encouraging one, Hobby Lobby versus Burwell in 2014. And Obergefell versus Hodges, we know about. It's been in the news a lot about same-sex marriage, right? Or no, about abortion, right? And 303 Creative versus Elenis in 2023. This was a Christian web designer. All of these have to do with people being challenged, usually over always over their Christian convictions, because in the case of Hobby Lobby, they didn't want to provide birth control for their employees as part of their benefit package. And you might say, well, I don't have anything against birth control. Yeah, but lots of Christians do, and they have every right to be against it. I mean, frankly, all Christians were against it 100 years ago. There wasn't a Christian who was for it. We were like frogs in the kettle, and things that Christians would have found ghastly 2 generations ago, we just take for granted. But it doesn't matter. I'm not saying we shouldn't use birth control, although I never wanted to, never did. But the fact that a Christian thinks they don't believe in birth control and they are forced to provide it is simply a violation of First Amendment rights. And fortunately, the courts found it so, but for a while it was in the news. There were certainly people trying to make a case against them. Well, let me just end with this. Jesus said in John 16:32, "In the world you'll have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." We are to have tribulation. In 1 Thessalonians 3:4, Paul told the Thessalonians, "I told you when I was with you that we would endure persecution, as you have. You found that it's true." In Romans 8:35-39, Paul says, "What can separate us from the love of Christ?" He gives this long list of things, including tribulation, the sword, and this kind of thing. And he says, "In all these things we're more than conquerors through him who loved us." We defeat them. If you can defeat Satan by not loving your life to death, it means that though you look like you're the one who lost, you're the one who won. You won. You're more than a conqueror. If you're faithful unto death, you get the crown of life. The overcomers are the ones that are promised all the goodies in the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Those who overcome will receive these things. Who are they? Well, they are the ones who do not love their lives to the death, according to Revelation 12:11. Ephesians 6:10, the beginning of the armor of God passage, Paul says, "Be strong, therefore, in the Lord and in the power of his might." Now, what's that mean? You're at war, and when you're at war, your life is potentially in danger. But you are not being strong in your own strength, but you're strong in the Lord and by the power of his might. This is the thing that we Christians in America and in times of peace know much less about than most Christians throughout history have known. And that is the supernatural power of his might. The grace that God gives for supernatural strength and sustenance to Christians who are willing to suffer and die for him. And I don't know this to be true. I mean, the Bible does say that he has taken the sting out of death. I actually wonder, because I do know this, that I have had times where great trials came and great grace came upon me, so I hardly knew the trial was there, honestly. And I actually wonder sometimes if Christians, when they're being stabbed or shot or this kind of thing, if God just gives them the kind of grace that they barely feel it. I don't know. I'm not promising that, because Christians go through painful things too. But it does seem amazing when you read the stories of the martyrs, how they gave these signals to each other. Hey, this isn't really that bad. Surprise. You know, that God is at that moment doing something that we can't see. No one can see, but the person going through it knows it. Now, I just want to give you some figures here, because sometimes when we say, well, Christians have been slaughtered by the thousands their whole history, it certainly must eventually eliminate Christianity if this keeps up, and especially if nowadays, I mean, there's more surveillance, there's more ways to kill people in masses and so forth. Certainly Christianity would be wiped out with this kind of a trend. Well, the opposite is true. Christianity has only grown. 2,000 years ago, of course, there were only 120 Christians. Later the same day, there were 3,000, but earlier that day, there were only 120. And as history went on, of course, the movement grew through many tribulations. It grew very fast. By 1430, which is before the Reformation, the Earth's population was 1% Christian. 1 out of 100 people on Earth were Christians in the year 1430. 360 years later, by 1790, that figure had reached 2%. So it took 1,400 years for the church to reach its first 1% of the population. 360 years later, it was now 2%. That's rather rapid increase. By 1960, which is another 230 years, a smaller gap, it reached 4%, doubled again from the previous figure. By 1995, which was 35 years after the previous date, the figure is 11%. It almost tripled in 35 years. And that's in our time. Now today, which is 25 years after that last statistic, how many people in the world at least profess to be Christian? We can't say how many are real Christians, how are not. God only knows. Do you know how many do? 1/3. 1 person out of 3 on the planet are part of some Christian movement. They may be Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or Coptic or Protestant. And we know there's many people in these movements that we wouldn't recognize as born again people. But let's face it, these are people who say Jesus is Lord. 1 person out of 3. It was 1 person out of 100 in the 1400s. And it crept up from that. But just from 11,000 to 33, from 11% to 33%. That tripling took place in the last 25 years. So what if it triples again in the next 25 years or less? That'd be 99%. If it triples again, that's 99%. Now, I'm not saying it'll ever get there. We may not have that much time. And it may be that there'll be slower growth in the future. But let's face it, during the time when the church has been persecuted mercilessly, it has grown like weeds in the lawn, which is the way the devil's people have seen it. There are weeds in their lawn, but we win. I had some more statistics. We're going to pass on that. I thought I'd close with 1 John 2:8, where John says, "The darkness is now past, and the true light is already shining." And of course, the light came in John's day. He saw the light. He saw Jesus. And he said, the darkness is past now. The light is shining. And it says in John chapter 1, the light shines in darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. The light has been shining, and the light is advancing. But we shed that light when people see Jesus in us. And sometimes the best way for them to see Jesus is to see us crucified, because that's what Jesus looked like. And we have to recognize that when we evangelize people, and maybe when you were evangelized, many times some important elements are left out in American evangelism. And there's also a high mortality rate among converts, especially in times of persecution. That is, if the time of persecution would come today, if soldiers would break into a megachurch today and say, okay, everyone who's a real Christian, stay here, everyone else get out. I wonder how many people would still be there. Hopefully a fair number, but I believe the majority of people who have been evangelized today are not ready to do. I didn't sign up for this, That's not what I'm in it for. But it is. It is what we signed up for. And it makes it very clear that we have felt sometimes the luxury of not taking God seriously. But the early Christians didn't have that luxury. And I don't think we do either. For one thing, I don't wish persecution on us. Paul said we should pray for rulers that we would live peaceably and not be molested by the government. But there are times when the church really needs to wake up. And sometimes persecution is the tool that God uses, is the alarm clock. And we just need to be aware. If you're called on to die for Jesus, go to prison for Jesus, take a beating for Jesus, well, you're about average in terms of Christianity historically. You may be unusual in the moment, but it may not be that unusual in the future. We may see more of this where we are. We don't have any, in America, we don't have any innate right before God to be exempt from what all Christians, most of them better than us, have been going through for 2,000 years. So we need to live our lives in this world with that awareness that we are bearing a cross. It's a short walk. Our agendas, our plans, our long-time goals, those have got to be subject to God's will. He may not have the same plans for them. We need to live like people who have a short life, like people carrying our possessions in a coffin into the jungle, And that's the mentality of Christians. That was the mentality of the apostles. That was Jesus' mentality. And that should be ours, even if we don't suffer persecution like they did, even if we're never martyred. If that time comes, count it all joy, man. What a privilege it is. How would you rather die? In an automobile accident, or of cancer, or by a firing squad for Jesus? To me, it's a no-brainer. It always has been. So I thought I'd teach on it because, again, like I said, I never heard anyone teach on this subject. I read books on it all the time. I've been reading them since I was young, but just thought I'd do that just to do something a little different that I actually felt this would be something important to talk about at this time. I'm not sure why.